territory in an area that was at no time ever under its effective control. So if you're a country and someone comes and occupies your territory, Crimea or whatever, it's still considered to be your territory. But if you never exercise control there in the first place, it is hard to think of any example in which that would be considered the territory of that country. Now, there are areas where the Palestinians do exercise effective control, which is why I think their claim to statehood is actually far from frivolous. But none of the areas of the settlements happen to be those places. In the backside.
I'm curious how the Israeli Supreme Court has addressed some of these matters versus the perspective you're presenting here. How, in terms of similarities and differences, to the extent you know some of the key decisions?
Yeah. Okay. You will sometimes hear people say the following thing. Even the Israeli Supreme Court, I wouldn't call it even, I would say also, but even the Israeli Supreme Court has found that Israeli settlements are governed by the Geneva Conventions, that Israel is an occupying power limited by the Geneva Convention. People say this a lot. It is not true. It is not even a little bit true. What they have found is that by a government decision in 1967, right at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel said that as a matter of discretion, it will choose to voluntarily apply, going beyond the letter of the law, certain parts, certain humanitarian provisions of the Geneva Conventions to parts of the territory under its administration, because it didn't know what else to do with them. And it also made clear that it was not obligated to do so, and it didn't have to apply all of the provisions. And indeed, this is what the Israeli court says. The Israeli court says, when we analyze these questions, we will analyze them under the regime that the government has created, not because we're required to do so by international law, just because that's how the government's choosing to treat it. It's very analogous to when the Bush administration said that it will provide Guantanamo Bay detainees with various Geneva Convention protections, not because they believe they're covered by the Geneva Conventions, but just so people don't bother us about it. Going beyond the letter. So then, the Israeli court is simply in accordance, and they have not analyzed it independently as a question of international law. Yeah.
Well, some of this will come down to a political decision. That means looking at who the judges are. I mean, I know it's supposed to be a court of law, but the way these international bodies work is in part political judgments. We saw that with the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, where at least one of the judges at least has been accused of being biased. So could you comment on the current judges who would make the decision to whether to take jurisdiction?
Before it even gets to the judges, so the biggest jurisdictional decision is taken by the prosecutor. So again, it's a big world, and very few things in it get investigated. And the decision to investigate is a big bottleneck. Then at some point, jurisdictional decisions have to be confirmed by a panel of the court, a preliminary approval by the court, a three-judge panel, and it could be any three judges, and they're usually pretty serious about this. Again, if they were to accept these arguments, I wouldn't think it's necessarily because of anti-Israel bias, as because these notions have become so accepted in many ways as part of international legal discourse. It might be hard for them to rethink them afresh. On the other hand, they've generally been cautious, I think moderately cautious about jurisdiction. They've taken some cases they shouldn't have and have, I think, regretted it since. The Kenyan situation in particular, which has become a big problem for them. And the Kenyan situation, many people argued they should not have taken, because the argument was it did not satisfy the gravity threshold. Only a few thousand people were killed in a few months of inter-ethnic violence. And the basic thinking is that the ICC is not for a few thousand people being killed in a particular conflict, but for much more systematic atrocities. And now they're living to regret the Kenyan thing, because they got the relevant perpetrators elected. But no one knows. I mean, it's very hard to predict what the ICC would do, because it hasn't done much so far.
What do we know, though,
So
about the prosecutor?
I'll tell you what we know about the prosecutor. It's a new prosecutor. She is from Ghana, I believe. The previous prosecutor was from Argentina. The previous prosecutor was relatively aggressive and activist in his conception of the court's role, Moreno Ocampo. The big challenge to the ICC is this, it's a fact, that there's a concern that all of the cases that they have proceeded with so far, not all their preliminary investigations, but all the ones where they've brought charges, have all been African cases. Now, that is not the, and there's a lot of backlash in Africa about this. Now, some of that is warranted and some of it is unwarranted. That is to say, the part that's unwarranted is most of these African cases have not been, have been forced upon the ICC in a sense by the country themselves, itself. That is to say, it turns out that most of the cases in which the ICC is pursuing charges are a very unusual case, not what people expected the ICC to be dealing with originally, of self-referrals. So what's a self-referral? When you have a country, Liberia, Ivory Coast, there's a change of government, and the new regime does not want to prosecute the former leader because it's going to be a big security mess, they want to stay out of it, so they'll say, ICC, you guys take it. So they've accepted the jurisdiction. There's no one arguing on the other side. It's not one country versus another. It's a country sending its own people. So they've chosen to do that. So it's very hard to complain about these African cases if they're sent by the African countries themselves. I think it's really one case that everyone objects to, which is the Kenyan case, which was not a self-referral, but rather a sua sponte investigation by the prosecutor in a case which was already quite borderline. And the Kenyan case has massively irked the African Union. It's only one case, but it's enough to really to really upset them. And a lot of people say this is a colonial court, it's a white man's court. That's one reason there's thought that a Ghanese prosecutor was picked. But I'll tell you the irony. Finally, there's a case against Israel, the Mari Marvara case, right? And even the anti-Israel case is an African case. Comoros. Comoros. So even the Israel case is an African case. So there's a lot of pressure to bring a non-African case. Whether the prosecutor would see an Israel case as the best way to scratch that itch, it would certainly make all the people who are upset happy. Because the prosecutor's in a difficult position. Most countries in the world that are committing these crimes outside of Africa have not joined. Africa had a big mass sign-up, and has probably since regretted it, but China and Pakistan and India, they're all staying out of it. So who are you going to go after? You could go after European countries for NATO-type activities, but the prosecutor has seemed very unwilling to do that, not surprisingly, as these are their greatest basis of support. So Israel might be like the happy compromise. But clearly there is pressure to bring a non-African case. It's hard to imagine a European case. We have seen in previous cases, international courts like the ICJ went out of its way to avoid hearing cases involving NATO crimes in Kosovo, which were quite seriously alleged. And I assume the ICC might have similar sentiments. So then, who's left? On the other hand, it would not be politically costless for the ICC. And so, I think they would be in a pickle. I think they would be in an uncomfortable situation. My assumption, overall assumption, is they probably would not want to hear an Israel case if they could avoid it.
One more question. So just back to the semantics. So if Israel is not an occupying power, then why is it not an occupying power, and what should we call it?
Okay. Occupation is a technical term under the Geneva Convention. Now, okay, it could be an occupying power colloquially. The question is, that I don't know, that means whatever you want it to be. But under the Geneva Conventions, an occupation occurs when the territory of a state party is occupied. The West Bank was not the territory of Jordan. So it's hard to call Israel an occupying power then. By the way, under this, you could much easier argue that Israel is an occupying power in the Golan Heights, which was clearly Syrian territory. What would you call it? An administering territory? The country exercising jurisdiction? Let me tell you what you could call it. Okay. So, you know how the Europeans say that you're not allowed to do any business with occupied territory. The problem is what happens if you want to. So that's a nice rule if you don't want to. But what happens if you want to? And it turns out that Europe has been very interested in doing business in Western Sahara, to the extent that they just signed a treaty with Morocco, authorizing them to conduct various activities under Moroccan auspices, and paying Morocco for the privilege, in Western Sahara. But the problem is, Europe doesn't recognize Western Sahara as part of Morocco. They recognize it as Moroccan occupied territory. So how are you going to call that in the treaty? What are you going to say in the treaty to refer to Western Sahara? You can't say Moroccan occupied territory, because then people would say, that's against international law. So it's in Morocco and areas under its jurisdiction. Israeli-controlled areas, Israeli-administered areas, areas in Israel. I wouldn't mind calling them Israeli territories. I mean, what do we call Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands? American territories. Because they have not been incorporated as full-fledged states, but U.S. jurisdiction extends there. And by the way, the people there, even the U.S. citizens, they're not allowed to, they're not represented in the legislature. Apartheid. So Israeli territory, yeah. I mean, the problem is occupied Palestinian territories.
Why is it not recognized that Israel took control over this territory because of the victory in a war that was fought for it?
Oh, so that's considered not good enough.
I mean,
Except
Israel.
for some of these other guys.
That doesn't necessarily go to Israel's benefit because it's a violation of international law to capture a territory in an armed conflict, isn't it? Don't you have the obligation to retreat once the armed conflict is won and there's no threat to your existence?
Well, the United
complicated.
States.
No, it's a new rule. It's after we got what we wanted. It's from the UN
Right.
Charter. So the basic rule today is that you're not allowed to take territory by force. Now, with the West Bank, the argument's different, because if Israel had title there already from the League of Nations mandate, then you're not taking, you're restoring, that's a different question. And there's a separate question whether defensive conquest is illegal. Now, however, the strength of this norm about not being able to keep territory acquired in a defensive war, there's some evidence that you could take territory in a defensive war. What's the basic reason that you can't take territory in a war? Aggression is illegal. So if the underlying act is illegal, you can't keep what you got from an illegal activity. But since self-defense is illegal, the logic falls out. Now, you might want to recall that France occupied the Saar, very coal-rich region of Western Germany in World War II, and proceeded, this was after the UN Charter and after the Geneva Convention, proceeded to separate it from Germany and incorporate it as a French-controlled territory. You know the European Union? This was the original idea. This was the original Monet plan. France gets Germany's coal, and it's a European Union. In the end, they decided to give it back to Germany in 1956 for Cold War reasons, to keep the Germans happy. But France grabbed this region, took control of it, and put it under its law, presumably on the notion that since it was taken in a defensive war, it's okay.
I mean, the Jordanians retreated from Jerusalem, so Israel took control. So why is that such an issue if they essentially said, white flag, we're done?
But they did not give up their claims. Now, they did give up their claims in 1994. That's a bigger question. If you think that the land was Jordan's, why does the 1994 treaty not relinquish their claims? And if the land wasn't Jordan's, then isn't then of course the case that there was no previous sovereign claimant and it was in fact open for taking?
Question.
Yes.
Just as an aside, is the Russian claim on Crimea somewhat similar to the French situation as with the German territory in terms of, yes, it was given in 1954, it was transferred back to Ukrainian jurisdiction, but that was also for political reasons, and they also...
The only French claim to the German territory was we conquered it and we like it.
Right, but what I'm wondering is under the kind of...
Defensive conquest?
defensive reasons, but also the fact that they fought a war over it, in the 1800s and whatnot. I mean, so what I'm wondering is, in terms of legal reasons, do the Russians have
The Russians have
any
absolutely no
basis?
legal claim.
Okay, that's what I understood. But
Well, actually, I'm happy that you brought up Crimea.
Okay.
No?
I'm just saying it's a natural subject to bring up.
Very happy that you brought. It's very related to what we're talking about. Very related. So everyone agrees. The biggest argument so if you want to know what would people say to these questions you bring up, the biggest response is, well, look, the international community has already agreed. We've agreed. We got together, and you're not sitting at our lunch table. So if international law worked as a popularity contest, it's true that Israel would be voted off the island, but it generally does not work that way. So Crimea. Everyone agrees that Crimea is legally part of Ukraine and that Russia's annexation is illegal. Now, why should Crimea be part of the Ukraine? Is it because the people who live there are Ukrainians? No, they're not. They're Russians. Okay, well, maybe they don't want to be part of Russia. No, actually, they really do. Well, maybe because it's historically been part of the Ukraine. No, not really. So, what's the problem? Khrushchev gave it as a birthday present, and that's it. Was it good? Was it right? Did anyone ask the Crimeans? Does not matter, because you go with the last internationally recognized boundaries. Uti potededis juris, fundamental rule of international law. What are the last politically internationally recognized boundaries here? The League of Nations mandate, which is from the river to the sea, which was certainly not changed by the Jordanian invasion, A, because the Jordanians' claim of annexation was not recognized, and B, for the same reason as the Russian invasion of Crimea does not change the previous international border. So the exact same reason. Now people say, but what about the Palestinians? Okay, but what about the Crimeans? Crimeans are very happy being part of Russia. Maybe not 97% happy, but that should not distract from the fact that they're probably 80% happy. So it's indeed the Ukrainian claim for Crimea is actually much weaker than Israel's claim. All Ukraine can point to is a fit of generosity by the General Secretary. Wrote a little piece of paper, didn't ask anyone. Israel has a League of Nations mandate. It's a lot better. Most people don't have a League of Nations mandate.
Could the Jews then have relinquished their rights and title under the League of Nations mandate by accepting the partition?
Yes.
So did they?
No. Yes and no. That is to say, the partition was a deal. If the other side would have
Right.
accepted, then that would have been an effective relinquishment. It's like if you say yes to a contract and the other guy says no, then generally it's thought there's no meeting of the minds.
Okay.
They can still relinquish. They're desperately trying to find someone to relinquish to.
Okay. Any
Thank
more
you so much for
questions?
coming.
Oh, just one more thing. So if you were to summarize for us then, back to the ICC, what the plan should be. Number one, diplomatic activity, going around to the United States, to Russia, convincing them of the shared implications. Number two would be to make the argument in the court that you do not have a jurisdiction. If that fails, accept the jurisdiction and try and get ICC to jurisdiction over Russia and Turkey. Paralleled with, I guess, a PR delegitimization campaign, that the fact that ICC doesn't have jurisdiction and nonetheless it's taken this case for political reasons. And then the fifth, how about bringing charges against the Palestinians for crimes committed within that territory that they claim to be the Palestinian state?
Absolutely. So listen, all current efforts should be geared towards the jurisdictional issues, because that's usually once jurisdiction is taken, it's already a bit of a big deal. And the jurisdiction, it's just a big part of, it's a big threshold. And currently, the Senate and Congress need to be made extremely aware of the implications to the United States of an ICC acceptance of jurisdiction. Under the Obama administration, the United States has become more supportive of the ICC and has cooperated with the ICC in various ways. Legislation should be promoted to tie continued cooperation to the ICC's proper fulfillment of its mandate and non-activist interpretation of its jurisdiction. And the public should be more educated about what the ICC means. So, because, you know, when they don't read newspaper headlines, America under ICC investigation for war crimes, even though it is. So it might seem like a big deal. Israel under ICC investigation. So, you know, Russia's everyone's under ICC investigation. So, and what has the ICC done? Has it ever prosecuted anyone for things that don't involve killing lots of people? So people should become aware of the basic parameters within which the ICC is operating to understand how this fits within their mandate and with what they have historically done. People think that there's this ICC with a big jail cell full of people that they have convicted. That's not the case, and that should be recognized. Also, I think it is useful, again, before any decisions about jurisdiction are made, to begin preparing dossiers and explaining the inevitability of the Turks and Russians, at least, becoming involved in such matters. One might add that European companies should become aware, European countries should be aware, that if the Sahrawi can pull off the same kind of stunt in Western Sahara, would all of the European companies very active in Western Sahara, which includes some of the most important, Total and whatnot, would they then become open for, and those European countries are already ICC members, would they then become, oh, that's even better! Right, the European countries are already ICC members, so the ICC has jurisdiction over their nationals, even for conduct not committed in their own territory. Yes, anywhere they go. And you don't have to be a member of the military to violate the ICC's war crimes provisions. So why not immediately begin informing of the ICC of the aiding and abetting of indirect deportation and transfer by Total Société Actionnaire in Western Sahara? That would really get them upset. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Total, I think, is the biggest company active, but then has so many large Spanish and French fishing concerns.
There's an idea for any project.
That's an idea.
Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.